We can't stay here.
But they will find us.
Not if we move now. You have no choice now.
No, please, not this!
Stay back!
Don't come closer!
It's over.
The heavy double doors of the master suite didn't creak. They glided open with the silent precision that Kwon Hyuk-jin demanded of everything in his life. He had intended to surprise Baek-era with a rare afternoon of leisure, perhaps to see the ghost of a smile grace her porcelain features. Instead, the air in the room felt as though it had been sucked into a vacuum. The afternoon sun, filtering through the sheer silk curtains, bathed the scene in a deceptive, golden warmth. In the center of the room stood Kim Woo-jin, the man Hyuk-jin had pulled from the gutters of Seoul and forged into his most lethal weapon. Woo-jin's hand, usually reserved for the cold steel of a handgun, was buried deep in the dark waves of Era's hair. And Era, his poised, untouchable wife, was pressed against the bodyguard's chest, her fingers curled into his suit jacket with a desperation that bordered on hunger. The kiss was a physical collision of two souls who had finally stopped running. It was thick with the scent of Era's expensive perfume and the raw, unpolished energy of a man who had nothing left to lose. Hyuk-jin didn't move. He felt the weight of the platinum watch on his wrist, the ticking of the seconds marking the exact moment his world inverted. He had spent a decade building a fortress of fear, believing that loyalty was a debt paid in blood and silence. He had treated Era like a masterpiece to be curated and Woo-jin like a blade to be sharpened. Now, he watched as the blade and the masterpiece merged into a singular, defiant middle finger to his entire existence. When they finally broke apart, the silence that followed was louder than a gunshot. Woo-jin didn't drop his gaze. He didn't scramble for an excuse or fall to his knees. He stepped slightly in front of Era, his posture shifting into a protective stance that was instinctively, infuriatingly noble. Era's breath hitched, her chest rising and falling beneath the vibrant red silk of her dress, a color Hyuk-jin had chosen because it reminded him of power, but which now looked like an open wound. Her eyes met Hyuk-jin's, and for the first time in 5 years of marriage, he didn't see the reflection of a dutiful wife. He saw a woman who had been drowning in his shadow and had finally found a pocket of air. Hyuk-jin reached into his inner breast pocket. Woo-jin's muscles tensed, his own hand twitching toward his waistband, ready to die for the woman behind him. But Hyuk-jin didn't pull out a weapon. He pulled out a gold-plated lighter, his fingers remarkably steady. He lit a cigarette, the flare of the flame the only spark in the frozen room. He exhaled a cloud of gray smoke, watching it drift toward the lovers. "Is this the part," Hyuk-jin asked, his voice a low, terrifyingly calm rasp, "where I'm supposed to remind you both who owns this house?" The silence that followed Hyuk-jin's question was a physical weight, heavier than the gold-plated lighter still warm in his palm. He stood perfectly still, his back to the door, a silhouette of absolute authority framed against the light of the hallway. Before him, the tableau of betrayal remained frozen. Woo-jin's hand had not moved from Era's waist. If anything, his grip tightened, a silent declaration that he would not be discarded like the countless enemies Hyuk-jin had ordered him to eliminate. Hyuk-jin watched the smoke from his cigarette curl lazily toward the ceiling, his mind functioning with the cold, clinical detachment of a grandmaster surveying a losing board. He looked at Woo-jin, the man whose life he had saved, the man who knew every secret, every sinew of the Kwon Empire. Then his gaze drifted to Era. Her red dress, usually a symbol of her status as the syndicate's first lady, now looked like a flag of revolution. There was no shouting, no shattering of glass or drawing of weapons. The violence was entirely internal, a quiet demolition of the reality Hyuk-jin had meticulously constructed. He searched their faces for the familiar flicker of terror he had spent years cultivating, but he found only a weary, desperate kind of peace. It was a realization that cut deeper than any blade. They weren't afraid of him anymore because they had already found something worth dying for. For a long minute, the only sound was the faint, rhythmic ticking of the platinum watch on Hyukjin's wrist. He felt the vastness of the mansion pressing in on him, the hundreds of loyal soldiers outside, the billions in assets, the terrifying power of the Kwon name. And he realized, with a sudden, sharp clarity, that he was the only person in the room who was truly alone. The betrayal wasn't just a transgression of the flesh, it was a revelation of his own obsolescence. He had built a world of shadows, and in this sun-drenched room, his two most trusted shadows had stepped into the light together. He took a final drag of the cigarette, the ember glowing fiercely before he dropped it into a crystal ashtray. The standoff wasn't a battle of strength, but a void of expectation. He was the monster who was supposed to strike, and they were the victims who were supposed to cower. By refusing to play his part, the air in the room grew thin, charged with a tension that felt like it might snap the very foundations of the house. He didn't look at them as he finally spoke, his voice barely a whisper, yet filling every corner of the room. "I have killed men for looking at my chair with too much ambition," he murmured, his eyes fixed on a point somewhere past them. "But I have never seen a man look at his death with so much relief." The silence in the room shifted, turning from a suffocating weight into a sharpened blade. Hyukjin turned slowly, his silhouette imposing against the sun-drenched windows, the smoke from his discarded cigarette still hanging in the air like a fading ghost. He looked at Wu Jin, whose hand remained firmly on Era's waist, and then at Era, who stood trembling but unbowed. The expected explosion, the gunfire, the shouting, the bloody retribution that defined the Kwon legacy remained absent. Instead, there was only the cold, mechanical clicking of the clock on the wall. "You are waiting for the end," Hyukjin said, his voice devoid of the usual melodic threat, sounding instead like dry parchment. "You have prepared yourselves to die together, thinking that a shared grave is a romantic victory over me." He stepped closer, his shadow falling over them, extinguishing the warmth of the sun. "But death is a mercy I only grant to those I respect. And today, I find I have no respect left for either of you." Wu Jin's jaw tightened, his eyes searching Hyukjin's face for the trick, the hidden trap. "Then do it," the bodyguard rasped, his voice thick with a defiance that shouldn't have existed. "Finish it, boss." Hyukjin smiled, a hollow, terrifying expression that didn't reach his eyes. "No. Today, Kim Wu Jin, you cease to exist. And you, Era, you are no longer a queen. You are simply a woman in a red dress who belongs to no one." He reached out, not for a weapon, but for the heavy platinum watch on his wrist. He unclasped it and let it fall. It hit the marble floor with a dull, expensive thud. "Go," he whispered. The word was small, but it carried the weight of an execution. "Leave this house. Leave your name, your clothes, your jewelry, and the protection of my shadow. You will walk out of those gates with nothing but the air in your lungs and the betrayal in your hearts." Era's breath caught in her throat. To be cast out was a sentence worse than death in their world. It was to be prey in a city full of wolves who knew they were no longer under the protection of the Kwon Syndicate. "If I see either of you within the city limits by dawn, my men will not be as patient as I am," Hyukjin continued, his gaze returning to the window, watching the city he ruled. "You wanted freedom. You wanted to be together. Now you shall have both in a world that will chew you up and spit you out before the sun sets again. You are not worth the lead in my gun." He didn't look back as he heard the hesitant, shuffling footsteps of the two people he had loved most, moving toward the door. He listened to the sound of his world emptying, the front doors heavy and final as they latched shut. Only when the mansion was entirely silent did Hyukjin allow his hands to shake, realizing that in granting them their lives, he had finally confirmed his own isolation. The mansion had never felt so vast or so cold. As the heavy front doors clicked shut, the sound vibrated through the marble floors, traveling up the grand staircase and dying in the rafters of the vaulted ceiling. Hyukjin stood exactly where he had been, the sunlight still mocking him with its bright, indifferent warmth. He looked down at the platinum watch lying on the floor. Without it, the silence in the room seemed to lack a pulse. He walked to the window, watching from behind the tinted glass as two small, insignificant figures crossed the perimeter of his estate. Kim Woo-jin's arm was around Beck Era's shoulders, shielding her as they passed the black-suited guards at the gate. The guards didn't move. They had received the silent signal from Hyuk-jin's private frequency. They watched their former brother-in-arms and the woman they once called Madam walk out into the exhaust and noise of the city, stripped of the Kwon name. Hyuk-jin turned back to the room. It was a masterpiece of curation, ancient vases, original oil paintings, and furniture that cost more than a suburban home. But as he scanned the space, he realized he didn't see art. He saw a ledger of empty victories. Every object in this house was a trophy of someone else's defeat. He wandered into the dining hall, where a table long enough to seat 30 sat polished and vacant. For years, he had confused the silence of fear for the silence of respect. He had thought that by owning the best of everything, including the best people, he had secured his place in the world. But loyalty that is bought is merely a lease, and fear is a debt that eventually comes due. He reached for his phone to call his second-in-command, to order a status report or a hit or a shipment, but his hand hovered over the screen. For the first time in his life, he didn't want to hear the voice of a subordinate. He didn't want to hear, "Yes, boss," or "It's handled." Those words felt like ash in his mouth. The realization hit him with a physical ache. He had removed the weakness from his life, but in doing so, he had removed the only light. The palace was no longer a fortress, it was a mausoleum. He walked to the liquor cabinet and poured a glass of amber whiskey, the ice clinking against the crystal with a lonely, hollow ring. He was the most powerful man in the province, capable of moving markets and ending lives with a whisper, yet he couldn't find a single reason to sit down. The assets were gone. The bodyguard who would take a bullet for him was gone. The wife who provided the illusion of a home was gone. He took a sip of the drink, the burn doing nothing to thaw the ice in his veins. He realized then that he wasn't the king of a dynasty. He was the ghost of a dead man, haunting a house that had finally become as empty as his own soul. The neon lights of the neon-soaked Namgu district flickered with a rhythmic, buzzing instability that mirrored Era's own heartbeat. Here, the air didn't smell of expensive lilies and floor wax. It smelled of fried oil, damp concrete, and the desperate sweat of 1,000 people trying to disappear. Era pulled her thin cardigan tighter over her red dress, the only garment she owned, now a target rather than a statement. Every time a black sedan slowed near the curb, her breath hitched, expecting a window to roll down and a barrel to emerge. Beside her, Kim Woo-jin walked with a heavy, uncharacteristic limp. He had spent years as the apex predator of the city's shadows, but without the Kwon crest on his lapel, he was merely another man with scarred knuckles and a haunted gaze. They had spent the last 6 hours moving from one back-alley employment agency to the next, only to be met with the same chilling wall of silence. The word had traveled faster than they could walk. Hyuk-jin hadn't needed to kill them. He had simply erased their existence. At a small, grease-stained recruitment office for day laborers, the foreman had looked at Woo-jin's ID, then at the man himself, before sliding the card back across the scarred wood. "We don't hire ghosts," the man had muttered, his eyes darting to the street as if fearing a witness. To help them was to invite the wrath of the syndicate. To feed them was to sign a death warrant. By midnight, they found themselves sitting on a rusted bench outside a closed subway station. Era looked at her hands, soft, pampered hands that had never known a day of labor, and felt the crushing weight of their new reality. They were free, but they were also starving. Woo-jin reached out, his hand rough as he took hers. "I'm sorry," he whispered, the bravado of their afternoon kiss replaced by a raw, jagged guilt. "I took you from a palace and brought you to the gutter." Era looked up at him, the harsh glare of a nearby street lamp catching the tears in her eyes. "You didn't take me anywhere, Woo-jin. You gave me back to myself." She leaned her head against his shoulder, the coarse fabric of his cheap jacket feeling more like home than any silk sheet ever had. "I'd rather be a ghost with you than a doll in a golden cage." Across the street, A dark SUV with tinted windows sat idling in the shadows. The driver didn't move, and the lights stayed off. They didn't see the lens of a long-range camera glinting from the back seat, nor did they know that even in the gutter, they were still being curated. The high-definition monitors in Hyuk-jin's private study hummed with a low, electric frequency, casting a ghostly blue pallor over his face. He sat in total darkness, a glass of untouched scotch sweating on the desk beside him. On the central screen, a grainy, long-range feed from a street-level camera showed the interior of a cramped, dimly lit laundromat in a district his drivers usually avoided. Hyuk-jin leaned forward, his eyes narrowing. He was waiting for the inevitable. He had spent his entire life studying the mechanics of human greed and self-preservation. He expected to see the cracks form, to see Era's frustration boil over as she realized her red silk dress was now a rag, or to see Woo-jin's resentment flare as he understood that his life of luxury had been traded for a bowl of cheap noodles. He wanted to witness the moment they realized that love was a luxury they couldn't afford in the gutter. But the screen showed a different story. In the corner of the frame, Era sat on a plastic crate, her head resting on Woo-jin's shoulder. There was no argument, no weeping, no accusations. Woo-jin was carefully wrapping a piece of athletic tape around Era's heel where her designer shoes had rubbed her skin raw. The way he handled her foot was filled with a reverence that Hyuk-jin had never displayed. When Woo-jin finished, Era leaned down and pressed her forehead against his, a quiet, intimate gesture that spoke of a shared strength Hyuk-jin couldn't quantify. Hyuk-jin felt a sharp, unfamiliar pang in his chest, not of anger, but of a profound, hollow envy. He had owned their bodies, their time, and their loyalty, but he had never possessed the quiet peace they currently shared in a room that smelled of industrial soap and poverty. He watched them share a single bottle of water, passing it back and forth as if it were a vintage wine. He realized then that his mercy had backfired. He had stripped them of their status to break them, but he had inadvertently stripped away the only barriers that kept them from each other. In his palace, they were subordinates. In the gutter, they were simply two halves of a whole. A notification blinked on his secondary tablet, a report from his intelligence chief about a clandestine meeting between three of his captains. The sharks were beginning to circle his own throne, sensing his distraction. Hyuk-jin ignored it. He couldn't stop watching the monitor, mesmerized by the sight of Woo-jin tucking a loose strand of hair behind Era's ear. He was the most powerful man in the city, yet he was a voyeur to a wealth he had never known existed. The silence of the Kwon estate was no longer the silence of respect. It was the silence of a vacuum, and in the underworld, nature abhors a vacuum. While Hyuk-jin sat in the flickering blue light of his monitors, the city beneath him began to grow teeth. It started with the quiet redirection of cargo at the Incheon docks. Shipments of high-end electronics and narcotics that usually bore the Kwon seal simply vanished into the warehouses of the rival Kong syndicate. The news reached the mansion not through a formal briefing, but through the frantic, stuttering voice of a young lieutenant over the encrypted line. Hyuk-jin listened as the man described a drive-by shooting at one of their primary gambling dens. 2 soldiers dead, the ledger stolen, and the signature of the Kong family left in the scorched asphalt. Usually, such an affront would be met with immediate, overwhelming fire. But Hyuk-jin only stared at the screen where Era was currently leaning her head against Woo-jin's shoulder in a cold bus station. "Boss, are you there?" The lieutenant's voice crackled, desperate for the order that would unleash the dogs of war. Hyuk-jin didn't answer. He felt the phantom weight of the watch he had dropped on the floor, a reminder that the clock was ticking on his own reign. His distraction was a scent in the air, a drop of blood in a pool of sharks. Across the city, the balance of power was tilting. The smaller gangs, once content to scavenge the scraps of the Kwon table, were now emboldened. They saw a king who had abandoned his throne to watch a ghost story on a screen. By midnight, the perimeter of the estate felt thinner. The guards at the gate shifted their weight, their eyes darting to the dark sedans that began to cruise slowly past the iron bars, cars that didn't belong to the syndicate. The atmosphere was thick with the ozone of an approaching storm. Hyuk-jin's second-in-command, a man with a face like scarred stone named Sang-min, finally entered the study without knocking. "The Kong family has taken the northern routes," Sang-min said, his voice a low vibration of suppressed fury. "Your captains are asking if the king has gone deaf, or if he's just waiting for the crown to be taken from his head." Hyuk-jin finally looked up, his eyes bloodshot and distant. He saw the betrayal in Sang-min's stance, not a betrayal of love, like Eris, but the cold, calculating betrayal of a man looking for a stronger leader. The empire was fraying at the edges, the very thing Hyuk-jin had spent his life building now feeling like a shroud. He realized that by letting Era and Woo-jin live, he hadn't just spared them, he had invited the end of everything else.
The blue light of the monitors began to feel like a shroud as Hyuk-jin sat unmoving, his gaze fixed on the digital grain of a world he no longer understood. The Empire was screaming for blood, but it was the silence of his own inner circle that finally broke through his trance. Sang-min had left the room, but the air remained thick with the scent of a coup. Hyuk-jin reached for his secondary phone, the one encrypted for the deepest levels of the syndicate's dark web communications. His fingers, usually as steady as a surgeon's, hovered over the keypad. He began to navigate through the hidden channels of his own organization, looking for the whispers he knew were there. He found it in a buried ledger under a cleaning expense. It wasn't a requisition for a hit on the Kong family or a retaliation for the stolen cargo. It was a private contract, funded by a collective of his own lieutenants and signed by Sang-min. The target wasn't an enemy of the state, it was two ghosts. The order was clinical: remove the stain on the chairman's honor. Eliminate the deserters by dawn. The realization hit Hyuk-jin with a coldness that eclipsed any betrayal of the heart. His men, the very soldiers he had trained to be extensions of his own will, had decided he was too weak to do what was necessary. They were going to kill Era and Woo-jin to save the Kwon brand, treating his mercy as a malfunction that needed to be repaired. To them, Era in her red dress was no longer a person. She was a liability, a flickering candle that needed to be snuffed out to keep the darkness of the syndicate absolute. Hyuk-jin looked back at the monitor. Era and Woo-jin were huddled together in the corner of a dimly lit bus depot, oblivious to the fact that the shadow they had escaped was now sending its most lethal hounds after them. They were finally happy, finally human, and because of that, his own men viewed them as a disease. He didn't call Sang-min back into the room. He didn't issue a counterorder. He knew that the moment he tried to stop the hit, he would be confirming his own obsolescence. The lieutenants would see it as a final confirmation that the king had lost his mind for a woman and a traitor. Instead, Hyuk-jin stood up, the chair scraping harshly against the marble floor. He didn't reach for his watch or his cufflinks. He reached for a heavy, matte black case hidden beneath the false bottom of his desk. If his men wanted to clean up his reputation, he would show them exactly what the Kwon name was built on, but it wouldn't be for the sake of the empire. For the first time in his life, Hyuk-jin wasn't acting as a boss. He was acting as a man who had seen something beautiful in the gutter and realized it was the only thing in the city worth saving.
The rain began as a cold, greasy drizzle, slicking the corrugated metal of the abandoned shipyard where Era and Woo-jin had sought refuge. Inside the skeletal remains of Warehouse 12, the two ghosts huddled near a rusted shipping container, their silhouettes flickering in the dying light of a single battery-powered lantern. They didn't hear the three black sedans kill their engines a block away, nor did they see the four men in tactical gear flanking the northern entrance, their silent submachine guns raised with professional indifference. The lead assassin, a man Woo-jin had once trained, signaled for the breach. But as he reached for the heavy sliding door, a shadow detached itself from the darkness behind him. A single, muffled crack echoed, not from a silenced barrel, but from the snapped neck of the point man. Hyuk-jin stepped into the pale moonlight, his tailored suit discarded for a dark, high-collared combat jacket. He looked less like a businessman and more like the reaper the city feared he was. He didn't hesitate. Before the other three could turn, Hyuk-jin was a blur of calculated violence. He didn't use a gun. He used a short, serrated blade, moving with a feral grace that mocked the stiff training of his subordinates. Inside the warehouse, Woo-jin lunged to his feet, shielding Era as the sounds of the struggle reached them. He expected the door to burst open with a hail of lead. Instead, the heavy metal groaned and slid back slowly, revealing a lone figure standing amidst the fallen. Hyukjin stepped into the dim lantern light, his breathing shallow, a smear of blood darkening his cheekbone. He looked at Woojin, then at Era, whose red dress was now smudged with oil and soot. For a heartbeat, the old hierarchy flickered in the air, the boss and the traitors. Woojin tightened his grip on a jagged piece of metal he'd scavenged, his eyes hard and ready for the end. "Drop it, Woojin," Hyukjin said, his voice a low rasp that carried no malice. He tossed a heavy bag at their feet. It landed with the metallic clink of passports and stacks of untraceable currency. Sangmin sent them. He thinks my silence was a weakness. He'll send more by morning. Era stepped out from behind Woojin, her eyes wide with a mixture of terror and dawning comprehension. "Why?" she whispered. "Why save us now?" Hyukjin looked at her, really looked at her, and saw the way she held Woojin's hand. Even now, he realized that by destroying the assassins, he had destroyed the last bridge to his empire. He was no longer protecting his assets. He was protecting the only proof he had that a different life was possible. "Because," Hyukjin murmured, turning back toward the rain-swept darkness, "the king is dead, and I'd like to see if the man can survive the night." The rain drummed a relentless, hollow rhythm against the warehouse roof, but inside, the air was heavy with a finality that transcended the storm. Hyukjin stood by the open door, his silhouette framed by the jagged gray skyline of the city he was about to lose. He reached into the inner pocket of his jacket and withdrew a thick, leather-bound envelope. He didn't hand it to Woojin. Instead, he stepped toward Era, his movements stripped of their former predatory grace, replaced by a weary, human stillness. He held the envelope out to her. "Inside are 2 passports, a deed to a property in the countryside, and the keys to a vehicle parked 2 blocks south," he said, his voice barely rising above the wind. "The names won't mean anything to you now, but by dawn, they will be the only names you have left." Era took the envelope, her fingers brushing his. For a brief second, the memory of their marriage, the cold galas, the silent dinners, the transactional smiles, flickered between them. But as she looked into Hyukjin's eyes, she didn't see the man who had owned her. She saw a man who had finally realized that ownership was a poor substitute for belonging. "You're staying," Woojin said. It wasn't a question. He stepped up beside Era, no longer a bodyguard, but a partner. The jagged piece of metal he had been holding was gone, replaced by the weight of a new responsibility. "Sangmin and the others think they can inherit a kingdom by killing a ghost," Hyukjin replied, a ghost of a smile touching his lips. "I need to ensure they spend their night chasing shadows while you find the light." He looked at the 2 of them, the bodyguard and the wife, the soldier and the queen, and saw a unity that his billions could never buy. "Go. Don't look back. The city has a short memory for those who don't want to be found." Woojin gave a single, sharp nod, the last salute he would ever give his commander. He gripped Era's hand, and together they stepped toward the rear exit, disappearing into the mist of the shipyard. Hyukjin watched them until their silhouettes merged with the gray. He felt the phantom weight of his empire falling away, layer by layer, until there was nothing left but the cold air in his lungs. He walked to the center of the warehouse, picked up the discarded lantern, and blew out the flame. In the darkness, he wasn't a boss, a husband, or a king. He was finally a man standing alone, waiting for the dawn to decide who he would become. The final hour of the Quan dynasty did not end with a roar, but with the quiet, rhythmic scratching of a match against a box. In the center of his father's study, Hyukjin watched as a single spark caught the edge of a thick, leather-bound ledger. This book was the map of his empire, the names of the politicians he owned, the routes of the shipments that fueled his wealth, and the records of the blood debts that kept his captains in line. As the flame licked the paper, the ink began to curl and vanish, turning a decade of absolute power into a pile of gray ash. Outside, the city was in turmoil. Sangmin's coup had begun, sirens wailing in the distance as the rival Kong syndicate and the internal dissenters tore into each other, fighting over a throne that Hyuk-jin was currently burning to the ground. He poured the last of his whiskey over the remaining files, watching the blue flames dance across the desk. By morning, there would be no evidence left to convict a king, but more importantly, there would be no empire left to inherit. He was leaving them a kingdom of ghosts and debt. Hyuk-jin walked to the mirror, looking at the man who had walked into a sunlit room just days ago and seen his life for what it truly was. He didn't see a boss anymore. He saw a man who had finally understood that the weight of the world is easier to bear when you aren't trying to own it. He took off his wedding band, a band that had never represented a union, only an alliance, and left it on the edge of the burning desk. He slipped out through the service entrance, moving past the panicked guards who were too busy choosing sides to notice the man who had created them. The night air was sharp and smelled of rain and distant smoke. He didn't take a car. He walked toward the ferry docks, his hands in his pockets, his face obscured by a simple, dark hoodie. As the ferry pulled away from the pier, Hyuk-jin stood at the stern, watching the skyline of the city recede. Somewhere in the vastness of the countryside, two people were waking up to their first day of true freedom. And here, on the dark water, Hyuk-jin was beginning his own journey toward a different kind of life. He was no longer the man who ruled the shadows. He was a traveler seeking the light, carrying nothing but the quiet peace of a soul that had finally let go. The Kwon dynasty had fallen, and for the first time in his life, Hyuk-jin felt truly alive. The salt spray of the Incheon terminal bit at Hyuk-jin's face, a sharp, cold reminder that he was no longer shielded by the climate-controlled glass of a limousine. He stood at the railing of the departing ferry, his hands buried deep in the pockets of a plain wool coat. Behind him, the jagged silhouette of the city skyline began to shrink, its millions of lights flickering like dying embers. For over a decade, those lights had represented his territory, his burden, and his cage. Now, they were merely distant sparks in a world that no longer knew his name. The fall of the Kwon dynasty was already a headline on the discarded newspapers tumbling across the deck, but to Hyuk-jin, it was yesterday's skin. He thought of the two ghosts he had sent into the countryside. They were likely waking up to the sound of birds rather than sirens, their hands entwined without the shadow of a bodyguard or a boss looming over them. In losing them, he had found the only truth worth keeping. That power is a hollow currency when it cannot buy a single moment of genuine peace. This journey serves as a profound meditation on the nature of authority and the high cost of emotional isolation. Hyuk-jin's transformation teaches us that true strength is not found in the ability to command others, but in the courage to release them. He learned that loyalty coerced through fear is a fragile mask, destined to crack the moment it encounters the heat of real connection. By choosing to dismantle his empire rather than destroy the people he loved, he proved that redemption is always possible for those willing to walk away from the throne. The educational value of his story lies in the realization that we are often the architects of our own loneliness. Hyuk-jin had built a fortress to keep the world out, only to find he had locked himself in. His final act of mercy was not just for Era and Woo-jin, it was for himself, a shedding of the boss persona to make room for the man. As the ferry pushed deeper into the dark waters, the heavy silence of the mansion was replaced by the vast, open quiet of the sea. He was no longer a king, and he was no longer a ghost. He was simply a traveler, finally light enough to move toward the horizon.